Hello everyone and welcome to my open studio. I'm Miriam Rudolph and I'm a printmaker based in Winnipeg, Canada. I was born and raised in Paraguay in a small Mennonite town in the Chaco. In 2003, I moved to Winnipeg to study fine arts at the University of Manitoba. Here I was introduced to printmaking and I fell in love with the medium. I was fascinated with the technical skills required to make a print because of the variety of processes involved, starting with the preparation and etching of the plates with countless ways to create marks on the copper surface, followed by mixing inks, inking and wiping the plates, the handling of specialty papers, and ultimately the printing itself, which is magic every time. Printmaking has often been used as a medium for the expression of political ideas, and I'm following in that tradition. I completed a master's in printmaking in 2017 at the University of Alberta. I'm now settled in Winnipeg with a house, a home studio, a large vegetable garden, my husband, and our sweet little Max. I acknowledge that I grew up on the territory of the Intlit in the Paraguayan Chaco, and that I currently live on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. I loved growing up in Paraguay, and I had a happy and carefree childhood. I'm well aware that I had a privileged life. My dad was German, a language arts teacher at the local Mennonite high school in a small rural town. He traveled a lot with us through parts of South America and Germany. Having also studied history, he loved museums, and every trip and summer holiday included several museum visits in pretty much every city we went to. Today, of course, there is much debate about the provenance of collections and the circumstances of their acquisitions, providing ample opportunity to engage with our colonial histories and perhaps giving us a chance for dialogue and reparations as our understanding and thinking changes. I was thrilled when I was approached by Laura from the British Museum to ask if I was interested in doing an artist residency to create an artistic response to their Paraguay collection. The collection consists of Indigenous artifacts collected by British Anglican missionaries Seymour Hawtrey and Wilfrid Barbrook Grubb at the turn of the 20th century. Since I wasn't able to go to London and access the objects in storage in person due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the London team photographed and uploaded the images of all the artifacts. There were tools, ornaments, and ritual objects. I struggled to connect with the artifacts that appeared on my computer screen. They belong to a different culture and time that I have little personal knowledge of. Nonetheless, I was very curious about their story and their current existence in storage. This project gave me the opportunity to research the early colonization history of the Lower Chaco from the Anglican perspective and to further explore the colonial history of my own roots, the settlement of the Mennonites in the Central Chaco beginning in 1927, which resulted in the displacement of the Intlit Norte. For me, these artifacts are the starting point to question history. What does the collector, Wilfrid Barbrook Grubb, tell us about the objects and his time in Paraguay? What do Indigenous voices have to say about their past and present? What do my own people, Mennonite settlers, tell about their arrival and settlement in the Chaco? Whose experience, whose history is being told, preserved, taught, and perpetuated? While the histories of interaction between the Anglican missionaries and the Intlit Sur on the one hand, and between Mennonite settlers and the Intlit Norte on the other hand are not the same, I felt the general colonization processes were so similar that they lent themselves well to juxtapose the different perspectives on the history of the region. I decided to include text in my work and create an artist's book because I spent so much time reading during the early stages of the project, and the different perspectives of the narratives were just so jarring. I was struck by the outdated language and use of certain words from the early texts. As shocking and problematic as some of those texts are, I find hope in the fact that we think differently today, that we are moving forward with our understanding of a multicultural coexistence and of the necessity to decolonize our thinking. I found many texts profoundly moving because they changed my own understanding of my history and helped me make sense of things I have sensed before but didn't have the words to express. For each theme that delves into the processes of colonization, I chose roughly 3 text excerpts to accompany each print, with first-person accounts by Indigenous elders, recorded and published only within the last 30 years, texts by Mennonite settlers and scholars who have kept a record of the Mennonite experience spanning the past century, and the experiences of Anglican missionaries from about 100 years ago. The text excerpts are printed in color to form a visual thread throughout the reading that connects them visually and conceptually with the images. Please let me present the result of this artist's residency. A museum case, a collection of prints and texts. Layered Histories, Perspectives on Colonization from the Chaco, is an artist's book that explores the complexities of colonization of the Paraguayan Chaco region. For the past year, I've printed a series of 12 prints, accompanied by text pages that explore the diverging narratives of experiences and history. The prints and text excerpts trace the events of early contacts between European missionary explorers and settlers through the change in landscape and ways of living of the indigenous people, to today's attempts at indigenous assertion of their rights and tentative perspectives for the future. Remembering. With the first print, I want to acknowledge the starting point for the project, the Paraguay collection at the British Museum. Looking through the uploaded photos of the collection, I noticed a system of boxes, physical storage boxes stacked on shelves, digital folders labeled Box 1, Box 2, Box 24, numbered, labeled, categorized, organized. The square format references the acts of organizing and closing, boxing in and boxing up, collecting and storing the collection, also embodied in the museum case that houses this artist's book, as well as the colonial imposition of a certain kind of order, of will, of a way of life, and of a way of thinking. The print plays with the idea of the boxes and the ordered grid, contrasted by the densely growing forest that provided everything the Intlet Sur needed to live. The gray cloud and drips evoke a kind of loss, a loss of culture, and a fading of memories of the importance and the meaning of the artifacts with time. Out of all the hundreds of artifacts in the collection, I was drawn to the long necklaces made of little discs cut from shells and pierced with a hole to be threaded onto strings. They were used as currency. The longer the necklace, the more worth it had. I find the idea of creating your own currency based on skill, time, patience, need, and want interesting. The second object I chose to print was a pipe head. In a later text excerpt, one of the Intlet elders talks about how a Mennonite missionary threw their pipe in the fire to weaken the power and influence of the elders and shamans. The pipe represents a cultural power that was taken away. Terra Nullius. My maternal grandparents migrated to the Paraguayan Chaco in 1927 from Manitoba, Canada. Growing up, the general Mennonite history narrative was always, and continues to be, something like this. There was nothing here but wilderness. We arrived in a green hell. The Indians welcomed us and helped us with the farming. We made something of this land. God sent us here to evangelize the Indians. They came to us because they were starving, and we helped them. We coexist peacefully to this day. This narrative follows a typical settler mythology pattern based on the concept of terra nullius, meaning nobody's land, empty land that is vacant, uncultivated, unproductive, somehow lacking and incomplete. as Roger Epp puts it. The concept of terra nullius does not acknowledge the right of indigenous people to exist in the land that form an integral part of it, and gives the settlers a sacrament of innocence. The digitally printed background of the print is an early sketch map by Anglican missionary Seymour Hawtrey from 1900, who literally put the Chaco region on the map. Maps are used for laying claim, for surveying the land, for parceling, selling, privatizing land, for claiming ownership. The dense forest is both beautiful and a terrifying wilderness, depending on the view of the beholder, providing life-giving space to some and representing something that needs taming and ordering for the other. The arrival of the missionary explorers, backed and supported by politicians and ranchers, figures printed on the backside of the translucent paper, pushes the wilderness back. Neocolonial landscape portrays the change in landscape after the settlement of the region. Simeon Negro, former leader of the Entlet community Campo Largo, says, "The Entlet had many places in the Chaco. A large circle describes that land of the Entlet. Today we live within a very small circle in Campo Largo. Nevertheless, we maintained the memory of the places of our ancestors because it is very important that the young be able to compare both circles so that we don't think it is impossible to have more space than we do today." In my print, a large circle of forest shines through from the backside of the paper, while only a small section of forest remains in the landscape of fields and pastures. Kelvin Redekop, Mennonite sociologist, writes, "A plane ride over the Chaco impresses the observer with the vastness of the area and the degree to which it is forested and undisturbed. But suddenly the sweep of the eye over the flat topography is broken by a man-made ordering of the environment. Abruptly, the forest gives way to cleanly cleared fields, geometrically laid pastures and roads, orchards, farmyards, villages, and towns." Throughout the prints, I continued to play with the square format with the inclusion of digitally printed early maps, contemporary satellite imagery, and the grid, which pertain to land surveying, mapping, and fencing in imposed order from outside. Roads. One of the first steps in the colonization process of the Chaco after loosely mapping the region was the establishment of roads. The Anglican missionaries prided themselves for creating inroads and making the Chaco more accessible to European ranchers and settlers. Metiayam, member of the Entlet people, recounts, "After the Mennonites came, they began to choose campos. They went in different directions to choose campos and made roads through the fields of the Entlet. The Entlet, however, didn't want to give up their fields. They wanted to keep their sweet potatoes. The Mennonites set up posts, which the Entlet didn't like at all. 'No, not here,' they said. But there was nothing to be done. The Entlet didn't want to give up their fields. While the sweet potatoes were growing, the Mennonites built their roads through the fields of the Entlet, built their villages on their fields. The Entlet didn't want to give up their fields, but the Mennonites didn't listen to them. Eventually, the Entlet gave up." The account by Metiayam has hit me hard. Time and time again, we were told the indigenous people were so incredibly poor and starving when the Mennonites arrived. Yet Metiayam clearly shares that they had seasonal gardens that provided food, which the Mennonite settlers destroyed. The hunger came after the settlement. Fences are a symbol of privatization of land, a point of pride for landowners, and a necessity for cattle ranchers to keep their property safe and contained. Fences frequently appear in indigenous accounts as an obstacle that cuts off traditional pathways and hunting grounds, that limits movement and keeps their traditional lands inaccessible. Entlet elder Mang Vayam Ai describes the following scene. "We lived on the other side of the fence until we were approached by Hako Piayem, a Mennonite from Nempena Amiep. 'Do "Do you want to hear the word of God?" From then on, we lived in Chaco Piayem's yard. No longer did we stay on the other side of the fence. In most indigenous accounts, the fences kept them out. Here, they are invited in. Mang Vayam Ai and his people are invited to join the newcomers, but they are expected to change. Crossing the fence symbolizes a point of no return, of leaving the traditional way of life on the other side. I really struggled with the image for the print Encounters, and it only came together at the end of the project. I felt a discomfort trying to figure out how to portray encounters between the settler population and indigenous people. From the text excerpts, I also get a sense of discomfort, where the indigenous narrator feels excluded, misunderstood, and judged by the settlers, and the settler voice expresses fear and trepidation towards the other. I think to this day there is much discomfort and unease in encounters due to overt racism, unequal power dynamics, prejudice, and inequalities on every social and economic level. The print is divided in half by the repeated grid pattern to evoke the separation between the settler and indigenous communities. The figures representing the settler men and women are large and strongly drawn and etched. The size and strength of these figures alludes to their position of power. They fill half the page and spread out freely within the space, while the more delicately etched indigenous figures are confined to a much smaller and clearly outlined square. Herein lies an irony. The settlers fear the indigenous people, while they themselves are the ones taking over the other's land and a way of life. The missionary is the go-between figure. While most settlers don't interact much with indigenous people, at least not beyond an employer-employee relationship, the missionary has direct contact to communities. However, he generally represents the interests of the settler community that backs him. From my own experience, I always felt a deep chasm between communities, a clear us and them. To this day, there is a separation between white settlers and indigenous communities. We don't share schools, churches, or hospitals. We live in separate towns and settlements or reserves. The gap between rich and poor is staggering. Indigenous people are generally laborers working for Mennonite employers and have little or no political representation. Most decisions regarding life in the Chaco are made by the settler communities and governments, and decisions regarding indigenous people are made in a top-down, paternalistic way. Dispossession. Ownership of land is a European capitalist concept completely foreign to the indigenous people of the Chaco who lived in a sharing economy. Again, the grid reflects the surveying, parceling, and privatization of the land. The dripping vegetation evokes a sadness and a loss. The blank figures of indigenous people appear to have their presence erased in a way, but they also convey strength in their stances. The leading female figure on the right, overlapped with the bottle tree, references a stronger female presence in the social structure of the community, but she almost disappears. Dispossession does not only refer to being dispossessed of land, but also of culture. Mission. Missionaries appear on the frontiers of colonization. The Paraguayan government welcomed the presence of Wilfrid Barbrook Grubb and gave him the title of Pacificator of the Indians in 1892. Missionaries were seen as benign figures that would befriend and pacify indigenous communities, to introduce European thought, religion, and way of life, to prepare the way for future settlers and the development of the land. The background of the print mission is a map of Maclawaya by Walter Reguer from 1979, the Anglican mission station founded by Barbara Grubb. To the left is an outline of the mission buildings. To the right, on the other side of the road, are two neat rows of cottages for the indigenous inhabitants surrounded by farmland. I picked up on the rows of houses and printed several models of cottages in 2 rows in my print. The indigenous figures are confined within one small square. The preaching missionary is lecturing in the bottom left corner, backed by the interests of a politician and a settler. There is a physical space between the missionary and the group that alludes to the distance between them. The print exploitation depicts a large cattle herd pressing forward that dominates the image. Cattle ranching has taken over large parts of the Chaco and contributes to the displacement of indigenous communities. Also, indigenous laborers are frequently employed in the cattle ranching industry. They build the fences, they tend to the cattle, they work on maintaining the pastures by clearing bush and brush. They also predominantly work in the meat processing plants, and as far as I know, most of this is done for minimum wage. While there are labor laws in place now, when the settlers first arrived, much of the work for the Mennonites was done in exchange for food or clothes. The settler community prides itself very much for their work ethic and all they have achieved in building a lucrative export industry of beef and dairy that has brought them a high living standard. However, the success and wealth has been achieved through the exploitation of cheap indigenous labor throughout the past 95 years. Wilfred Barbrook Grubb writes in 1910, "The Indian, for the next generation or so, must be content to earn his living by manual labor. While we impress upon him that we regard him as a fellow man and brother, we at the same time leave him under no misapprehension as to his place in the world being a humble one until such a time as, in the course of evolution, he is qualified for a higher plane." Loss. The losses indigenous people in the Chaco have experienced throughout the colonization process are unimaginable to me. A loss of land and territory, a loss of home, a loss of culture, a loss of a way of life, a loss of a sense of identity, a loss of autonomy, of freedom, a sense of power, a loss of an understanding of the world. This was a difficult piece to do. I am keenly aware that I am attempting to express someone else's experience, and the portrayal of a kind of victimhood can be problematic, but I believe that feeling empathy for others' losses is an important process towards understanding. To me, acknowledging the losses and wrongdoing is an essential step towards any kind of reconciliation and healing process. Hans Wiens writes that Mennonite missionary Dietrich Lepp, a young zealous worker, wanted to eradicate shamanism and sorcery. He forbade the medicine men to work at the mission stations. As soon as he heard their singing, be it day or night, he went there and told them to stop. In Disruptions, a large group of indigenous figures is marching and blocking a road. The repeated layering of the figures darkens the tone and helps to give them a stronger presence. Now the positions are reversed from previous prints. The indigenous figures take center stage and fill out a large portion of the image. The figures of politicians and settlers are pushed to the corner and forced to watch and act. This print is based on a protest in 2015 by members of the Entletsur and Sanapanak community of Sakmok-Kasek, which ultimately resulted in the restitution of a portion of the ancestral lands with the backing of a ruling by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. To me, this protest symbolizes a direction of thinking that interrupts colonial patterns. It shows that different ways of thinking, acting, and being are indeed possible. I wanted to end my book on a somewhat hopeful note, with a view to a future that might be more just and equitable for everyone. The title, Remembering, carries multiple meanings. The importance to remember the past through subaltern voices, and to bring people in from the margins, allowing them to again become members of society in their land. The figures in this print come together as a community. Settler women stand next to indigenous women. Settler children stand next to indigenous children. A politician stands next to an indigenous man. I re-etched all the figures representing the settler society for this print, to scale them down to the same size as the figures representing indigenous people. With the change in scale, I wanted to portray the importance of an equal society, where people see and treat each other as equals, where political decisions are community-based and not top-down. One of the most interesting texts that I feel rounds off the book really beautifully is the text by former Anglican missionary Stephen Kidd. He came to Maclawaya, the Anglican mission station Wilfrid Barbrook Grubb founded, 95 years after Grubb. Kidd writes, "As my Christian faith withered away, I gradually developed a different perspective on Intlit culture and social life, and my personal mission changed from one of transformation to a desire to share in the life of the Intlit. Rather than seeking to eradicate Intlit social practices, I became increasingly committed to trying to understand and experience them." We often think of colonization as a process of history in the past, but the impacts of colonization continue to pervade everything in our lives today. Social structures and systems, our perception of land and property, the content we are taught in schools, the way we think about, interact with, and treat others on whose land we now live, whose artifacts we store, work for us, and whose experiences are not taught in schools. While this project looks at a very specific art collection and a very specific region in Paraguay, there are similarities with colonial history and colonial thinking the world over. This artist's book invites to question our biases, our perceptions, and our understanding of history, and challenges us to decolonize our thinking.